Well, hey guys, it's Mr. Schauber, and I would like to review with you some things that you probably should have learned in 8th grade U.S. history, and this is going to be kind of a quick review of a bunch of stuff from the very beginnings of U.S. history until just after the Civil War. And so the review might take a little while, but it covers a ton of information, and so hopefully this is some of the stuff you remember, and some of it it's just going to be a good refresher for you. But let's get going, and uh, the first topic is the cultures that converge to quote unquote start the United States. When we look at the cultures that really converged on the US and eventually blended together and are still mainly represented here, there are three of them. The first being Native Americans. Native Americans, by and large, lived in tribes and clans. As you can see here, I wrote that they believed the land could not be owned. This is going to create some problems when the Europeans come, and Europeans will plant a flag and say, hey, we claim this land in the name of the king or queen of such and such a place. And the Native Americans just were confused, saying, wait, you can't own the land. The land is Mother Earth, and we just live on the land and we use the land. Um, but Native Americans believed in a lot of ancestor worship in general. But one thing I think we need to understand about them is, as you look at this map here, Native Americans, all these different tribes, they were very different from each other uh, oftentimes. Spoke different languages, different styles of clothing depending on where they lived, ate different types of foods depending on where they lived. And so obviously, one common misconception is that Native Americans were all alike. Well, that's not true. Native Americans were very different, and and some were friendly toward the Europeans that eventually come, and some are not friendly toward them. And anyway, so but Native Americans were kind of the original ones here, and of course one of the three main cultures that blended eventually to become what we know as the United States. So Europeans are the second group. Uh, the Europeans really started their interest in sea travel by the late 1400s, and Portugal became kind of a dominant country in sea travel. Spain then became a dominant country as well. Eventually, places like Italy and the Netherlands and France and England got in on the mix as well, and went all around the world claiming different territories for their kings. And we kind of know that history, but Christopher Columbus, this is where he comes in. He was from Italy. He wanted to sail for Italy, but Italy wouldn't fund his trip. He wanted to sail then for Portugal. They wouldn't fund his trip. He finally went to Spain and said, hey, I think I can get to the Indies, which were already known. India and China were very potentially rich spice ports for Europeans. And so he said, I think I can get to the Indies going west. Like I said, Italy and Portugal both refused to fund him, but Spain agreed to do so. And so in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? And he came west from Spain and he ended up in what is now the Caribbean. He thought he had landed in India. And because of that, he calls the people Indians. And so after this, eventually they realize they're not in India. And other Europeans start to flood westward from Europe and land in what is now the Americas. Some went to South America, some went to Central America, eventually some to North America. But this is kind of the beginning of really the flood of European exploration of the Americas. And then the third main group were the Africans. Now, most of the Africans did not come here by choice. They were involved in the slave trade, but traditionally Africans, also kind of similar to Native Americans in the Americas, lived in tribes and clans, a lot of ancestor worship. They valued the land. And one thing that has to be remembered is not only with the Native Americans, but also with the Africans, because they were so different in their tribes and clans from each other oftentimes, they also were at war with each other a lot. and they would capture each other and enslave each other, and that was just part of their life. And so, but when the Europeans start going into Africa, they see a source of free labor that they can take to the Americas and force them to work. And so the slave trade will begin uh, with Europeans and Africans in modern times. Of course, slavery has existed in human history since the beginning of human history, basically. But but in modern times, the Europeans into Africa is where this really gets going. And so, as mentioned, the slave trade. Europeans go into Africa. They will take Africans, transport them to the Americas. Very dangerous trip. To be a slave trader was very dangerous, but potentially very lucrative. A lot of money involved, and you're dealing in human cargo. And how anybody could think that slavery was okay uh, in any time in world history, I don't really understand. I can't get that. It's obviously inherently wrong, but it's been a part of history. And so the European slave trade of Africa uh, began to bring the Africans to the Americas. Now, all the countries pretty much that were involved in colonizing the Americas from north to south got involved in the slave trade. And so it wasn't only the English, it was also the Spanish, of course. It was the Portuguese. In fact, of all the slaves ever taken out of Africa, historians estimate that about 40% went to what is now Brazil. And Portugal was the one that colonized Brazil. So the Portuguese were perhaps the largest slave traders in history. Of course, the Spanish brought a lot over as well to Central America and the northern part of South America, and eventually the English will get involved in that and bring them to North America, among other groups as well. But this is the slave trade. It's a horrible thing, obviously, but it is a part of our history that we cannot ignore, and it it now contributed then to Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans being in what is now the United States. And so, as we look at these three cultures, what's really interesting is we see remnants of these cultures, we see evidences of these three cultures all over the place in our lives today. Um, the Europeans, of course, with the English language, with some of the food, some of the styles of dress. Native Americans with a lot of the names of rivers and cities and states and mountain ranges and foods, and so you see that all over. Africans with styles of dress and especially music. Uh, the African slaves oftentimes would sing traditional African songs, which eventually kind of came into the churches with the gospel music, and eventually blues and jazz and rock and roll, and from there, all the different genres of music we see today. So all three of these cultures have contributed greatly throughout history to what we see today as the American culture. So kind of interesting when you look back at the very beginnings and the cultures that blended to become, quote unquote, the United States. All right, the next item of study is early colonization. You can see the years I put on there, 1585 to 1699. Now, that's a long time. But here is the beginnings of English attempts to colonize and then successfully colonizing the eastern part of the United States. This attempt kind of begins with Sir Walter Raleigh. You can see he was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, and she trusted him. She really liked him. Queen Elizabeth never married, never had any kids, but she definitely had some guys that she liked, and Walter Raleigh was one of them. He gets permission from the Queen to try to colonize America, and so he comes over with a group of colonists, and they land off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The place they land, they will call Roanoke Island. And this is in 1585. It's their first attempt to settle, and it does not end well. People they're starving, and it's extremely hard work. You got to remember, most of these people that came over with Walter Raleigh were people that had some means, they had some money. They weren't really necessarily used to really hard labor and hard work, and so you have to cut down trees and clear land and build houses and plant crops and deal with the Native Americans sometimes who aren't friendly. And so that first attempt ends in starvation, and they go home. They go back to England. Well, a couple years later, they say, "Hey, we tried it a couple years ago. It didn't quite work, but at least we know kind of what we're dealing with now. Let's try it again." And the second attempt in 1587 works for a little bit. The colonists get here, and they start working hard, and they plant their crops, and it seems to kind of be working, and looks like the colony's going to stick. And then something crazy happens. What happens is that Walter Raleigh will go back to England to get more settlers to bring over to strengthen the colony. And when he comes back, the people he left behind who looked like they were going to make it are all gone. Nobody's left at Roanoke. In fact, the buildings are still standing, the fields are still there, but no people. And the only thing they find is the word Croatoan written or carved on a tree. Well, the Croatoans were one of the local Native American tribes, and so we can only guess what happened. This is one of the first great mysteries in American history, if you will. But probably the Croatoans most likely raided the colony, killed the settlers, took them off as slaves. Something happened there, obviously. But when Walter Raleigh comes back, he does not find anybody there in the colony, and obviously, uh, this these new colonists that he brought with them decide, we're not going to stay around. And so no one ever knows exactly what happened to those settlers who were looking like they were going to survive. Uh, but this is the end for Walter Raleigh as far as his attempts to colonize. And so he goes back to England, and it seems to be that the English are done attempting for a little while. Well, they were done trying to colonize for a short time, but Queen Elizabeth will then die. And like I said, she was never married, had no children, so she had no heirs to pass the throne to. Well, her nearest relative is a cousin named James. And so King James becomes the leader of England. And in 1607, he says, "Hey, wait a minute here. My cousin Elizabeth tried to colonize the New World through Walter Raleigh, and it didn't work, and then it kind of did, and then it didn't. Everybody disappeared, and so I'm going to try it. Let's give it a shot." And so in 1607, colonists come back over, and it ends up being the first permanent English settlement in North America. It's modern day Virginia. The colonists will name their colony Jamestown in honor of King James. And this is going to be a brutal, rough time for these colonists, especially at first. The colony does make it, but only after some craziness. Uh, it's crazy hard work. People will starve. People will die. People will die of illness. But enough people make it, and then enough new settlers come from England to strengthen the colony that they end up surviving. And so this is our first permanent English settlement in what is now the United States. What helps Jamestown survive is a couple of things. One of them being the local natives. Some were not very friendly, but some were, including Pocahontas, born Matoaka. She married one of the English colonists, John Rolfe, converts to Christianity, eventually changes her name to Rebecca Rolfe. She will actually be over in England, uh, and when she passes away, and she's buried there. But she and some of the other natives help the Jamestown colony. They help them with the crops and what works, how to plant the crops and what kind of crops grow well. And She and the other natives, some of the other natives, help these English settlers in Jamestown survive. The other thing that helps Jamestown survive is the crop, tobacco. Tobacco was in high demand at this time over in Europe, and tobacco grew really well in the soil there in Virginia. And so the colonists will grow tobacco, row after row of it, and they're able to ship it back to Europe and trade it in and sell it. And this helps them survive. This helps the colonists back in Jamestown get more supplies and food and money from Europe to be able to survive. And so tobacco is the thing that saves Jamestown. Make no mistake about it. But and it was only after a lot of hard work and a lot of people passed away, of various things before Jamestown is able to really stick. But they make it work, and Jamestown, like I said, then is our first permanent settlement. Well, seeing the success of Jamestown, other English colonists decide they want to come over as well. And in 1620, a group aboard the Mayflower set sail for America with about 100 people, 100 pilgrims, as we'll call them. They were of the Puritan and Separatist religion. They were very strict in their religious beliefs. They were tired of getting persecuted for their religious beliefs in Europe, and so they set sail for America. And they were bound for Jamestown to kind of link up with an already established colony, but they got blown off course to the north, and they landed in modern day Massachusetts. And these colonists come over and start building up Massachusetts, and one of the main towns they built up was Salem. Of course, they'll build Boston and other towns in Massachusetts, but Salem was one of the most prosperous and growing towns in Massachusetts early on. But in 1692, just 72 years after these colonists arrive from England, uh, one of the most crazy, bizarre incidents in U.S. history happens in Salem, and those are the Salem witch trials. It started with some younger girls in town who started acting weird and claimed to see things and spirits and roll around on the ground in church and babble in strange languages. And they started to accuse people of being witches, including the girls accused their family slave woman of being a witch and riding on a broomstick around the house. And of course, none of that was true. But they accuse her of being a witch, and then pretty soon they accuse other people in town of being witches and warlocks, which are male witches. And pretty soon the adults, enough people believe them that they start accusing each other. And families are pitted against families and friends against friends. And you would accuse somebody else of being a witch before they accused you. And by the time it's all said and done, over 100 people are put on trial. And 20 of them, including a dog, uh, 20 people and a dog, are found guilty of being witches and are killed. And this, like I said, as you can imagine, just destroys the town. It just rips it apart from within. And of course, Salem today is it's still there. There's people that live around the town and things like that. But you could go there today and see it as kind of just a historical place. But it was never the same after this. And it shows you what paranoia and when people accuse each other falsely of something, what that can do to a place. Um, but yes, this is a crazy thing. Of course, books have been written about this, and the movie The Crucible is about this, and it really interesting stuff. But this is what happens in Salem. And so, what we initially had then was Jamestown in Virginia, and Plymouth, and then other places in Massachusetts, and those become kind of the first two English colonies in what is now the United States. Well, eventually, people from England and other countries as well flood over to the eastern seaboard of the modern day U.S. and will form 13 colonies. And these 13 colonies will eventually, they're divided up by historians now, we look back, and into three groups: the New England colonies, the farthest north, the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies. And each of these colonies then And in these areas of colonies will kind of become known for you know, different occupations and different groups of people who live there, and different religious groups you know, who had moved in. And so these 13 original colonies then will eventually become pretty big, and mostly people from England, but also people from the Netherlands and people from other places. And these 13 English colonies will be ruled by the King of England. And these colonists at first are still loyal to the King of England and loyal to England and consider themselves Englishmen. But eventually that will start to change, and we'll talk about that. But these 13 colonies, these are them, as you can see, and this is where the United States really gets its start. All right, so let's look at the early American colonies, and then a couple of wars as well as we go into this new chapter of study from 1700 to 1783. First, let's look at the slave life in the colonies. Now, look, as a slave, life probably wasn't the greatest anywhere, right? Um, but it was generally worse the farther south you went in those 13 colonies. Up in the New England and Middle colonies, oftentimes they worked on smaller farms. They might be house servants. They might even be taken to work by their slave master and become an apprentice or things like that. But they were, and of course, each individual slave owner was, you know, how they treated their slaves was different, and most slaves were treated fairly well because a slave owner didn't want to mistreat, you know, his free labor. And so most slaves were treated decently over time, but they were still slaves. Um, some were very loyal to their slave masters and their families, and some were not as much. But the issue was the farther south you went, especially into the southern colonies, the farms got bigger. And in the southern colonies, of course, those farms are known as plantations. A lot of those farms were, and they were huge. And the plantation work is where a slave would be out working in the fields all day, you know, and it was brutal. It was hot and humid, and you know, you had taskmasters, uh, you know, watching over you to make sure you were working and so forth. And so uh, life was usually toughest for the slaves in general in the southern colonies on those big plantations. Well, here's what North America looked like in 1754. Years go by, the 13 colonies grow. Each of them get bigger, more populated. By 1754, of course, we're, you know, uh, almost 150 years after Jamestown. We're over 130 years after the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts. And so the colonies had grown up. And you can see, though, that the British claimed some of North America. The French had a large claim on the what is now, you know, kind of the Midwestern United States, over the Appalachian Mountains and up into Canada. And Spain had a huge claim on what is now the western part of the U.S. down through Mexico and Central America. And so, what happens then to get the U.S. looking like it does today? Well, let's look at that. In 1754, the French and Indian War breaks out. And this is going to be a defining time in U.S. history for a few reasons. One of them being this: the British and the French didn't like each other. They have a long history of not liking each other. And so, because the British claimed the eastern seaboard, the 13 colonies in the present day US, and the French basically claimed things to the west of that, you had Americans starting to move over the Appalachian Mountains and into French territory. And eventually, the French get tired of it. The Native Americans who lived there got tired of the English settlers encroaching on their lands. And so, the British and the American colonists team up against the French and the Native Americans. This war will last here in the Americas for 9 years. And uh, eventually the Americans and the British win. But what ends up happening is the Americans will lose a lot of respect for the British. Now, the British were supposed to have the best military in the world. And so the British, of course, were the generals, the commanding officers. They, you know, command the American colonists around in the war. But oftentimes, what the Americans saw were that maybe the British weren't as dominant as people thought militarily. Also, that in the thick of a lot of the battles, the Americans were the ones that were fighting the hardest and on the front lines. And when things got tough against the French and the Indians, sometimes the British took off and left the Americans to fight. And so the Americans lost a lot of respect for the British after this, even though the Americans and British, won the war. Well, when the war ends, the treaty, which takes place in Paris, called the Treaty of Paris of 1763, makes the Americas look like this now. Okay, and you can see then that the British colonies kind of stayed where they were, but then the French had to give or cede a huge swath of land to the British. And so all of a sudden now, American colonists see a new opportunity to keep moving west and move farther into the Great Lakes region. And um, and so the British section of North America has really grown now, and and this is going to be a big deal. Also at this time, England gets a new king, King George III. King George was king at 22 years of age. He was very strong-willed and stubborn, kind of insecure as a young guy. He grew into his kingship, if you will, as time went on, probably. But he was overall, from what we can tell, a decent guy. He was a good husband, loved his wife. He was a good dad, but he wanted to keep those American colonies at bay. The American colonists, who at first, of course, back in the old days, in the 16 and into the early 1700s, had always considered themselves Englishmen first. Uh, well, over time, by the mid 1700s, they start to consider themselves more Americans now. They're 3,000 miles away from England. That's a whole ocean away, and the king's far away. And really, the king, throughout time, the king of England, all they wanted really was they wanted taxes and loyalty, and they'd leave the American colonists pretty well alone. But the American colonists now start to see themselves as Americans. They're used to quite a bit of freedom and autonomy in the colonies. And yes, they'll pay taxes to England, but over time, they start to say, wait a minute here, we're doing our own thing now here in America, and we're used to doing our own thing, and we kind of like it that way. And so after the French and Indian War, King George says, well, wait a minute here, England's in big debt. We financed most of this war. We need to make up this huge debt, and the way to do that is through taxes. And so he not only starts to tax his English people in England itself, but he starts to tax and raise taxes more on the American colonists. Well, this is not going to go over well. And of course, we know then that some of these taxes that the British imposed on the Americans, uh, they went sky high to what the Americans were used to. So taxes on things like sugar and what they called the Stamp Act. Things, any printed material had to have a special stamp on it that the British charged an extra tax for. And tea, of course, that's the big British drink was tea, and of course the American colonists drank tea as well. And so the Tea Act and the Quartering Act, which required Americans to oftentimes house and feed British soldiers that were stationed in the colonies. And so the Americans said, "Whoa, wait a minute here. First of all, we have no representation back in Parliament in England making these tax laws. There's nobody back there speaking up for us. And so we have no say in this whole thing. And we're used to kind of having a say now in our colonial governments and in our towns on how things work. We're used to voting on things, especially the men were kind of used to voting on things in the towns for the American towns and American colonies. And so as King George III keeps imposing these taxes and high taxes on these Americans, this doesn't go over well, and Americans start to get really upset. Well, if there was one town in America that was kind of at the forefront of rebellion and standing up to these British taxes and really, being outspoken, it was Boston. Uh, Boston, had a large population at the time compared to most other American towns, and the Bostonians were were a tough-willed and tough-minded people. And so if there's going to be an incident or incidents that occur leading up to the Revolutionary War, you could pretty much bet that a good share of them will happen in Boston, and the Boston Massacre is no exception. It's kind of the first major thing that occurs that pits the American colonists against the British. And it happens in March 5th of 1770. There's still snow on the ground. Long story short, some colonists are out and they started a little skirmish with some British redcoats. Uh, there's looks like some snowballs thrown, some snowballs uh, with rocks in the middle thrown, and the the British redcoats get spooked. A few of them lose their cool and they fire on the colonists. And by the time it's all said and done, a handful of colonists are dead on the ground. And this, of course, is going to spark outrage among the colonists. The colonial newspapers are going to portray it like on the upper left there, like the British colonists, the British redcoats were just massacring. They call it the massacre, right? We're massacring these poor colonists. Of course, the redcoats are going to say, "Hey, wait a minute, we were the ones that were being, we were getting pelted with snowballs and rocks, and the colonists started it." And so each side, of course, is going to blame the other. But when it's all said and done, of course, you know that the sentiment among the colonists, not only in Massachusetts but throughout the whole of the 13 colonies, is going to be an anti-British sentiment because of this incident. And then, about 3.5 years later, as tensions were mounting over time after that Boston Massacre, in December of 1773, colonists disguised as Native Americans will board British ships docked in Boston Harbor full of crates of tea, very valuable cargo, and they dump all the tea from 3 of these British ships into the harbor. They call it the Boston Tea Party, of course, and that is a ton of money, uh, a worth of tea dumped into the harbor. Of course, the British were trying to get the colonists to only buy their stuff, only buy British goods, and of course, the colonists had developed kind of a underground black market to buy and sell goods among themselves. And the British were, every time they found out about that, they raised taxes and they put the clamps further on the colonists, and then the colonists just rebelled. And so you have the Boston Massacre, now you have the Boston Tea Party, and things are about ready to explode, and it would not be long before they do. Well, in the spring of 1775, the colonists are ready they can't handle the British redcoats being there anymore. They can't handle any more mandates or taxes from the king, and things are gonna blow up. Um, in April of 1775, the redcoats stationed in Boston, the British soldiers stationed in Boston, have got word that the Americans in Concord are stashing weapons illegally. And the redcoats are going to go and find those weapons and confiscate them and deal with the Americans. And so the redcoats go from Boston over to Cambridge. And from Cambridge, there is a road that leads, you can see, all the way to the town of Lexington and then to Concord. And getting word that the British are coming to inspect what's going on in Concord, Paul Revere, you can see his route is there in purple. Paul Revere will make the midnight ride as well as with some other guys as well throughout the countryside, warning the American colonists that the redcoats are coming and get ready and stand your ground and don't let them push you around. And so that's kind of the war cry. And this is going to be really the beginning of the Revolutionary War. This is when it really hits the fan, because these redcoats are going to march early morning uh, from Cambridge to Lexington, and it's going to be in Lexington that the first shots of the Revolutionary War are fired. And so the battles of Lexington and Concord, April 18th and 19th of 1775. This is the start of the Revolution. You can see there on that red line, that red road, that will lead to Lexington from Boston and Cambridge. And the redcoats show up, hundreds strong, led by their leaders on horseback, and a a group of American colonists that came to be known as Minutemen because they could be ready to fight in a minute's notice. They'd grab their uh, their powder and their bullets, their ball, they called them, and their guns, and they would go out and be ready. And these American colonists are waiting for the British on the town green, the town square in Lexington. And the British commanders come up on horseback and see this group of American colonists in their way and say, "Hey guys, get out of the way. We're on our way to Concord. Let's not have any problems here. Let us pass." And the American colonists say, "No, you're not going to pass through. You're not going to Concord. We're not doing anything wrong." And one thing leads to another, of course. Well, this is another mystery in American history. Nobody knows for sure who fired the first shot, whether it was a British redcoat or an American colonist, but somebody lost their cool, fired a shot, and once one shot is fired, the musket balls are going to be fired back and forth. And when the dust settles, a handful of American colonists again will be dead, laying on the Lexington town green. And the British march on through. They go to Concord. The Americans actually were stashing weapons in Concord, but by the time the British got there, the Americans had moved all the weapons, and so the British stay there and have lunch there and start back on their way on that same road back toward Boston that afternoon. And by this time now, the Americans have spread word throughout the whole countryside of what happened in Lexington that morning, and Americans from all over the place have grabbed their guns, and now they are waiting for the British redcoats to march back to Boston. And as the British are marching and the Americans are waiting for them, the Americans are behind the trees, behind the stone fence, walls. They're up in the forests, and the Americans will start shooting as the British march in their nice rows and columns, right? In the kind of the old school way. And one British redcoat would fall and get hit, and the other one would, another one would get hit, and some of them are wounded, some of them are killed. And the British just kept marching on this road as Americans are waiting for them to pick them off, as many as they can. And this is the Revolutionary War. This is how it begins, you guys. And there is no going back. Once these shots are fired in Lexington, and then, of course, fired on the way back from Concord to Boston, the war is on. News gets back to King George of what has occurred, and he is furious. He cannot let these American colonists do this to his professionally trained army and his British redcoats, best army in the world. And he is not going to take this lightly. He's going to squash the Americans, crush them. And this little rebellion, he says, is going to end quickly. Well, the Americans that want to fight against the British become known as patriots. These are the ones that want England out of North America. They want England out of the colonies. They're Americans. They want their individual freedom. They want to become their own country. And so these are the patriots. The Loyalists are the American colonists who stayed loyal to the British crown. They were still loyal to King George III and England in general. They still consider themselves to be more British than American. And it's estimated that about, estimates differ, but let's just say a good portion of the American public were believed to be loyalists during the war. And so this makes it very difficult for the Patriots. It wasn't like 100% of the American colonists were on board with this war. The Loyalists also sometimes grabbed guns and fought with the British, and the Loyalists helped the British out with intelligence and information, and so this made the Patriots' job even that much more difficult, which makes it that much more extraordinary and amazing that the American colonists are able to defeat this British army and win our independence. For the first year of the war, after that initial kind of shock that the British suffered in Massachusetts on the road from Concord back to Boston. After that, the British really kind of regroup, and the British will start to win. And for that first year of the war, things don't go great for the Americans. Uh, we're trying to hold on. We have to form our own army basically, and put somebody in charge of it, and we have to name generals, and we're kind of a ragtag group. We're not a professional military. These are farmers. These are blacksmiths. These are people just grabbing their muskets and forming into companies and trying to fight against a professional army in the British. And so uh, the Americans really need a boost after the first year. And it's after that first really year goes by that a group of leading Americans will meet together in Philadelphia, at the State House in Philadelphia, today known as Independence Hall, and they will draft a letter to King George. And this letter becomes known as the Declaration of Independence. People like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and other leading Americans sit around and they debate. Okay, we're writing this letter to King George. What are we going to put in it? Uh, we can see it's dated July 4th of 1776, and that's why today, July 4th, is known as our Independence Day, because that's the day this was dated with. But the Declaration of Independence is really a letter to King George, and it lists the grievances that the American colonists have against King George and England. And it goes through very systematically and lists the different things that King George has done to wrong the Americans. It says that everybody should have natural rights, basic rights, and those can't be taken away. And England has taken those away from Americans, and so Americans are fighting back now. We're declaring our independence. Now, of course, King George gets a copy of this, and he's upset, but he also kind of laughs it off and says, "Who do these Americans think they are? I have the best army in the world. I'm going to destroy this colonial army. I'm going to crush them, and I'm going to reconquer, just reestablish my authority in the colonies." He doesn't think the Americans have a chance. And if you looked at it on paper, honestly, we probably shouldn't have had a chance. But the American colonists that were fighting, the Patriots that were fighting against the English, were fighting for not only their lives and their families' lives, but their way of life and something much bigger than themselves. And so this letter, of course, has become one of the most famous documents in American history and in world history, declaring our freedom from England. And but we still, of course, had a war to win, and we were not winning at this point. So we still had to beat England to make this letter, this declaration, legitimate. And all these men who signed this thing know that if we don't win the war, they will all be rounded up. If the British can capture them, they'll be rounded up and they will be hung or shot as traitors. And so this is a death sentence if we do not win the war. So you talk about pressure. This is it. But the Declaration of Independence, Philadelphia, July 1776. Thomas Jefferson is the one who actually writes the Declaration, but the ideas that went into it were given and contributed by many different men. Well, long story short, again, this is a review. And so battles take place. The British win some, the Americans surprise the British and win some and win others. The Battle of Saratoga, though, in 1777, is going to be the turning point of the war. The longer this war goes, uh, the more unpopular it will eventually become in England among the English people. The more unpopular it will become among the majority of English Parliament. It's really only King George and a few people in English Parliament that want to keep the war going by the end. But the Americans win a huge victory at Saratoga, and it's the turning point of the war for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Americans see that they can stand up, better at least than they thought, to this British army. Second of all, the British had uh, the British had figured this war would be over quickly, that they would just crush the Americans, and now they see they can't do that. Also, after the Battle of Saratoga, the Americans gain a really important ally that's going to help us down the road. That ally was France. France was waiting to see if the Americans could win a crucial victory before they jumped in on our side. And the guy that really convinced the French to join us was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin had moved over to France. He was living over there. Of course, he was being spied on by the British at all times. They were trying to sabotage his efforts to get the French to help us. But Ben Franklin got in good with the King of France and the people. The people of France loved him. They made statues of Ben Franklin that are still there today in France. But Ben Franklin becomes a celebrity over there, and he convinces the king that the American colonists can win the war. Of course, the French are arch enemies to the British, since the dawn of time, kind of, and so the French were waiting to see if we could actually legitimately win this war before they jumped in. And after Saratoga, they're convinced, and they jump in and they provide a naval force that's going to be extremely important for us. They provide soldiers, and they provide leadership, men who would train our soldiers. They provide weapons and supplies, and this is going to be huge. And so, but Ben Franklin's kind of the guy that gets the deal done, and he is immortalized in France and, of course, in the United States for his efforts in doing this. George Washington, with his American troops and our French allies, finally in 1781, after really 6 years of fighting this war, have worn the British down. The British are shocked that they did not win this war quickly. They're shocked that they could not crush the Americans early on. And the longer this war goes, the more unpopular it has become. Like I said, over in England, and the Parliament's ready for this thing to be done. But King George just can't stand to lose the colonies, and so he keeps the war going. And I've skipped over so much of the war, some of the details, but this is a review. Saratoga was the turning point. Lexington and Concord was the beginning. I skipped over the battles of Trenton and Princeton that were huge American victories. I skipped over the Battle of New York by and large. I didn't talk about Valley Forge, but let me just mention that Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, a winter camp where Americans were without shoes and without supplies and starving and freezing. And this, testifies of the greatness of George Washington. George Washington had been named the commander of the Continental Army early on in the war. George Washington did not win every battle he ever fought in. He didn't win every single one. He wasn't invincible, but he was one of the great leaders of men that this world has ever seen. He was able to inspire men who were starving and freezing to keep fighting for him. He was able to inspire men who didn't want to fight anymore. They'd seen enough bloodshed and death. They wanted to go home. He inspired them to continue fighting for him. And not only to continue fighting for him, but the men loved him. They would do anything for George Washington. He was truly a man among men. He was one of the great ones, and he was able to carry Americans to victory in the end. His faith, his determination, his courage, his belief in the American cause, in American ideals, liberty, freedom. He believed in those things, and he saw it out to the end. And so in October of 1781, he and his Americans and our French allies surround the British. The British are penned up against, like I said, up against the water there at Yorktown, and the British are forced to surrender. The unthinkable has occurred. The greatest military force in the world is surrendering to a ragtag group of American colonists who shouldn't have had a chance in this war. At least that's what the British thought. But the Americans were fighting for their homes, for their freedom, for for things the British just didn't understand. And so, at the Battle of Yorktown, the general of the British troops, General Cornwallis, is forced to surrender to George Washington. Here's a rendition of Yorktown, George Washington there on the horse, General Cornwallis on foot, having to surrender. And as was the case in those days, it took a long time, even after the war got over, to finally sign the peace treaty. But the treaty happens in Paris. You see a common theme here. The French and Indian War, peace treaty happened in Paris. So does the Revolutionary War. But the Treaty of Paris of 1783 will officially end the Revolutionary War. It will officially kick the British, for all intents and purposes, out of the United States, this new country that has been formed from our 13 colonies. And then, of course, we'd move farther west and we will form new states, west of the Appalachians. But men like John Adams and Ben Franklin and John Jay will get the British to sign this treaty. And you can now see the new map, how it looks after the Treaty of Paris of 1783, after the Revolutionary War. The United States of America will be formed, and Americans are now free from England. Now, Great Britain still controls much of Canada, which is where a lot of the Loyalists during the war went. After the war, they moved up to Canada or moved over to England because a lot of them weren't too welcome in the United States anymore, as you can imagine. But Americans are now free. We're now independent. We're our own country. And the British king no longer controls what happens in the United States. And so, talk about providence and amazing blessings that the United States receives, and this Revolutionary War is, again, one of the great upsets in military history. And now we are our own country and can do our own thing. And so here's another map to finish this off. You can see what the borders after the Treaty of Paris of 1783 looked like. Of course, you have your 13 colonies, but now Kentucky is as a state and part of the U.S. You have the Northwest Territory of the Ohio River, which will become, things like Ohio, Michigan, states like that. Then you have the territory south of the Ohio River, eventually Tennessee and other places down in the southeast. So the United States not only is its own independent nation now, but we get a chunk of territory that the British controlled. And of course, the real losers in this are not only the British, but also the Native American tribes who who lived in these areas that now white Americans are going to be encroaching upon further and further as Americans move farther west. Uh, Americans, we'll talk about this down the road, but Americans believed that it was our destiny to continue to move farther west and keep going all the way eventually to the Pacific Ocean. And so the colonists who are no longer colonists, they are now American citizens, okay, are going to get this huge tract of land and eventually colonize it and populate all of it. And so the modern United States of America, as we know it, is born through the Revolutionary War and the peace treaty that follows. All right, now let's look at after the United States is established, at least after the Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris, and England is no longer in control of the United States. Uh, Now what happens? We're our own country. We have freedom. We have liberty. This is what we fought for. And now, what is going to take place? Well, this chapter or this period of study will talk about the Constitution and the expansion of the U.S. from 1781 to around 1820. So when the U.S. becomes its own country, and we've kicked the redcoats back to England, now we've got to write up our a constitution. We've got to write up some kind of a national document to unite the states and and make us a legitimate nation. And so the first attempt to do that is called the Articles of Confederation. It goes from 1781 to 1787, and it's only 6 years. It was a really good attempt. It just didn't work. It gave too much power to the states, not enough to the national government. There wasn't really no balance of power there, and it ended up not working. Long story short, uh, the national government didn't have any power to do anything or enforce anything, and so You started to have squabbles between the states over trade and different types of things, and the national government couldn't step in and do anything. But again, good effort, good attempt. It just didn't work in the end. Because it didn't work, James Madison realizes we need to do something quick before the states are at each other's are at each other's throats, and before our country breaks up, just as we want our independence. And so uh, he organizes in the spring of 1787 a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. He will later become our fourth president, but in 1787, he was the guy that organized the Constitutional Convention. It took place at Independence Hall, the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been written. And at this Constitutional Convention is where a new Constitution, the current Constitution that we have now, is written. And so, like I said, the Constitutional Convention happens from spring through summer into the early fall of 1787. Some of the leading Americans of the time were there, including George Washington. George Washington had not wanted to attend at first. He just kind of wanted to retire after the Revolutionary War and just live out his life at his Mount Vernon estate. And at the last minute, he decides to attend in Philadelphia. And he really saves the convention before it even starts. But once it starts, James Madison, who organized this and who invited all these men to attend, uh, they kind of look to him and say, okay, you invited us here. Now, what are we going to talk about? And Madison says, well, I have some ideas. I've been doing a lot of study, a lot of research on governments throughout history, and I have an idea of what I think will work. And so he had already come up with a framework or a plan for a new constitution. And for months, then these men, including George Washington and Ben Franklin and other leading Americans, debate uh, this new plan, and they want what's best for the nation. And so it has to apply to big states and small states and free states and slave states, and it's got to work for everybody. And this really is a meeting of compromise and back and forth on what is good for the nation, what is good for the people, and so this is it's a miracle that they got this Constitution hammered out in as short a time as they did. But this what emerges by September of 1787 is the Constitution of the United States that we still have. One of the major issues at the Constitutional Convention was slavery. And in the end, the convention didn't abolish slavery. It did agree to stop the slave trade uh, down the road, uh, but it did not abolish slavery, which of course will come back to haunt us later on. And of course, there's going to be a civil war over that, some 75 or so years later. And so uh, we the Constitutional Convention, the reason it was such a big deal is because the North didn't have slavery anymore, and the South did. The South didn't want to give it up, and the Southern states were ready to leave the Constitutional Convention over this issue if they couldn't come to a compromise. And so the compromise was, all right, we'll end the slave trade here in about 20 years, but we're not going to get rid of slavery for the time being. And the North was upset about this. The Northern delegates, by and large, wanted to get rid of it, and completely, but that's just not what happened at the time. Well, once the Constitutional Convention ends and the Constitution is in place, it still has to be sent around to the states to ratify or to approve. And eventually, all the states, all 13, will approve it, but they only do so after a Bill of Rights is added. 10 amendments, 10 add ons to the Constitution to protect individual freedoms and liberties. And a lot of the states already had their own, they had their own state constitutions and their own state kind of Bill of Rights, if you will. But uh, a few of the men that had been at the convention were wise enough to realize we need a national Bill of Rights, stuff that applies to everybody in the country. And and these are freedoms and liberties that everybody should have. And so, of course, these Bill of Rights uh, still apply today. They're still on the books today, of course, and we all look to them as some of the most foundational freedoms that we enjoy. Well, one of the things the new Constitution called for, that James Madison kind of had, he orchestrated and had the framework for, was three branches of government. We had an executive branch headed up by a president. We had a legislative branch, which would have the House of Representatives and the Senate, Congress. And we had a judicial branch, which would be the court system, led by the Supreme Court. Well, this executive branch would need a president, which we'd never really had before in this form, and so an election had to take place. And the unanimous selection among the people and the Electoral College was George Washington, the hero of the Revolutionary War, the commander of our Continental Army, and the great leader he was. He was easily chosen as president, and he will end up serving 2 terms in office. And so after those 2 terms, he decides that he doesn't. He there was nothing in the Constitution about just 2 terms like there is today. That's the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution today. So Washington could have kept running and been president for longer, but he said, no, no, 2 terms, 8 years, that's enough. I'm done. I just want to retire and go home to Mount Vernon and live out my life. Well, he did so, and within about a year and a half after being president, he will get sick and he will end up passing away. But he is our first president, as we all know, and he kind of set the precedence, established the way of doing things in presidency. George Washington, while he was president, um, kind of oversaw the building of a new capital city to be the seat of the government for the United States. Of course, it's named after George Washington, Washington, District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. But George Washington never lived there. Um, he was president, but the city was being built, and so by the time the city's done and ready to house the government, Washington has already served his 2 terms, and our second president, John Adams, will be the first one to live in Washington D.C. But Washington D.C., of course, with all its national monuments and all of its great things to see, really fantastic place to visit and really get to really fill up on the history of this country and see so many cool things. So, but yeah, Washington D.C. is built specifically to be the capital. It's between Virginia and Maryland, and a neat place. Speaking of John Adams, then George Washington decides after his 2 terms to be done, and so an election takes place in 1796 between John Adams, who was George Washington's vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, who'd served as Secretary of State for a while under George Washington. And so these 2 men, Adams and Jefferson, were close friends. And this is a very heated election. You can see it's the electoral vote 71 to 68. Adams wins this very close election. Because of this, these 2 men have a real bad falling out and are not friends for quite a number of years. Eventually, at the end of their lives, they will make up and become friends again, and which is a great story in and of itself. But John Adams becomes our second president by winning the election of 1796. Jefferson, bitter about losing the election of 1796, says, "Well, I want to be president." And so, in the election of 1800, it's a rematch, and this time Jefferson wins. And again, this doesn't help their relationship as far as some bitterness that had entered the relationship. They again they weren't very good friends, like I said before, and at this time. But by the end of their lives, they will become friends again. And what's really fascinating is that both men, as they have um, become pretty close friends by the end of their lives. They're old men down the road here, and the year is 1826. Both men will end up dying just hours apart on July 4th, 1826, the 50-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which both men, of course, had a crucial role in creating. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was the one that wrote the Declaration. So both men will end up dying on the 50th anniversary of that document. And amazing. But Jefferson wins this rematch in 1800, and he will now become president. Well, as president, Thomas Jefferson had eyes on increasing the size of the country. And France controlled a huge tract of land in what is now what we would consider to be the kind of the Midwest and going into the western part of the United States. And so Napoleon was the leader of France at this time. And he was trying to increase the size of his French empire over in Europe. And so he was fighting war after war and he needed money. And so he agreed to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, which would absolutely increase the size of our country. And Thomas Jefferson jumped at this chance to buy this Louisiana Purchase. So here is the Louisiana Purchase and the Louisiana Territory. You can see the size of it. Uh, when we buy this in 1803, Thomas Jefferson will spend $15 million on it. And I mean, that's a lot of money, right? Then and now. But it worked out to be a tremendous deal, one we couldn't pass up because it worked out to about 3 cents an acre, which an acre is about the size of a football field. And 3 cents an acre and instantly doubles the size of the United States. Okay, we doubled our territory with the stroke of a pen. And not only does it give us this huge swath of land, it also gives us New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi, which is a major port city, and it's going to create all kinds of economic boom in shipping and so forth. So this is a deal we couldn't pass up, the deal of a lifetime, and Jefferson jumps at the chance. Well, now that we have the Louisiana Territory, Thomas Jefferson says we have to explore it. We have to see what's out there. And so he assigns Lewis and Clark to head up an expedition to go from St. Louis, which was as far as we had kind of mapped out up to that point, St. Louis, Missouri, um, and to go through the Louisiana Territory and to um, make maps of the land, explore and see which Native Americans were friendly and which were not, explore plant and animal life, and really try to find and see if there was a direct water route from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which of course there's not, but we didn't know that at the time. But Lewis and Clark will start their expedition, which was kind of like sending a man to the moon, um, in our in our era type thing, and this was just incredible. So Lewis and Clark head out on their expedition, and they sail, or they will go from St. Louis up to present day North Dakota, and there they meet a young woman who was pregnant at the time, named Sacagawea or Sacagawea. And she was this young Native American woman who was married to a French trapper trader, and they joined the expedition. And this is going to be a lifesaver, literally and figuratively, for Lewis and Clark. Uh, Sacagawea speaks multiple Native American languages. She can translate, and her husband, of course, but Sacagawea also speaks French to communicate with her husband, and her husband speaks French and English, so he can talk to Sacagawea and then speak in English to Lewis and Clark. And with this, they're able to communicate with various Native American tribes on their way then from present-day North Dakota all the way into Montana and Idaho, and then eventually, of course, they get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Um, so this trip is amazing. The crazy part about this is it's going to last for for over a couple of years, and it's going to be dangerous. It's going to be exhilarating. It's going to be thrilling. It's going to be you know all the above. They almost die numerous times, and the crazy part was of all the dangers and perils they faced with nature and with animals and Native Americans. Uh, One man from the expedition will die, and he ends up dying from appendicitis, not from any of the other dangers that they encountered. So this was just an absolute miracle that they survived the way they did. But this talk about a trip of a lifetime and one never to be forgotten. And Lewis and Clark are able to make maps. They're able to get all kinds of plant and animal samples to take back to Thomas Jefferson. In fact, they take back a couple of grizzly bear cubs and uh, all the way to D.C. and give them to Thomas Jefferson as a present and let him run around on the White House lawn for a while. So um, it's something that is a miracle, kind of how it worked out, and it really will help expand the U.S. because now we have information about this territory that we bought, and so people start moving into it, and they start creating settlements on the Louisiana Purchase, of course, which is now part of the U.S., and new states will be formed from it, and so forth. So amazing, amazing how this works out. Here you can see the map. It's going to, like I said, it's going to be over a couple years, over a 2-year expedition, basically, and they're going to keep a daily journal of what happens. And one time their boats or canoes kind of overturn in a river, and the journals were about to be lost, and the maps are about to be lost, and Sacagawea saves them. But you can see they went all the way up the Missouri River to Fort Mandan, which is in modern day North Dakota, and then from there they go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now the thing is, by the time they get out of present day, basically Idaho, Montana, Idaho, uh, they're not in the U.S. anymore. That territory was controlled by Great Britain, but they said, well, we gotta go all the way to the Pacific. We gotta try to find a water route to the Pacific, and eventually they get on the Columbia River, which does take them to the Pacific. They'll go all the way to present day Oregon and build a fort called Fort Clatsop that they stay in over a winter, and then they start heading back, and they go back to St. Louis, and from there back to Washington D.C. to report to President Jefferson. And so, um, man, it's just incredible what happened to Lewis and Clark on their trip. And of course, you can still read about it if you want to read their journals and see the maps. You can go online and see those things. It's incredible. So, well, not long after the Lewis and Clark expedition, not too many years go by, and the United States is at war with England again. Great Britain was still bitter about losing the Revolutionary War, a war they never thought they should have lost. And they saw the United States as this young country and still trying to kind of find its footing, and we were, we were just a a nation in its infancy, and so England decides they're going to attack again and try to take back over the territory they lost in 1781, and so uh, the War of 1812 begins, and the War of 1812 is going to go for 3 years, and the English come over. They do some damage. They win some battles. They burn a lot of Washington D.C. to the ground, and it looks like they may win. You can see some of this war went up into Canada as well, and but the United States holds on uh, for 3 years. We hold on. We never surrender. We win some battles as well, and by the end of 3 years, the British realized the United States will never give up. The Americans will never surrender. It's costing the British money, it's costing them soldiers, it's costing them time and resources. And eventually, the British basically decide we're done with this. We can't beat them. And so the war ends. Of course, there's a little more to it than that, but that's the short of it. And so the United States staves off the British again in the War of 1812. Of course, it's during the War of 1812 that our national anthem of today is written by Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was actually a prisoner aboard a British ship outside of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. And the Americans had the fort. You could always tell which country had a fort or had a possession of something by the flag that was flying above the fort. And the American flag was flying, and the British ships were in the water, just shelling the heck out of uh, Fort McHenry, just bombing it through the night. And and as the night turns to morning, and the British were trying to bomb us into submission at Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key looks and he can still see the American flag flying, and he writes a poem. He writes a poem that will be put to music and become our national anthem, our Star Spangled Banner, he calls it, which is representative of the flag. And so we keep the fort. We fight off the British during this battle, and it's a glorious victory, a glorious time, right, for the United States. Well, after the War of 1812, and America has preserved its place as a nation and its liberty. Um, the next major issue the U.S. has to deal with is slavery. This comes back, and it will keep coming back time after time in the early to mid 1800s. The North, by this time, and for a number of years, had already outlawed and banned slavery. You were not allowed to have slaves in the North. But the South, especially in the Deep South, relied on its slavery, on its big plantations for a major part of its economy. And so the South was not willing to give up slavery in any way, shape, or form. They would not even hear of getting rid of their slaves. And and so what the country did was basically create a line. It divided the North and the South. And this line was well, we basically called it the Missouri Compromise that created the line. And because what would happen is if a new state wanted to be admitted to the Union, the big debate was, well, is it going to be a free state or a slave state? Is it going to not allow slavery or going to allow slavery? What's going to happen? And so if they allowed or if they created a state in the North, then you had to create a state in the South to balance it out, or vice versa. If you created a state in the South, which would be a slave state, you had to create a free state in the North to balance it out. So that, and the balance, what I'm talking about was in Congress. So you had an equal number of free states and slave states for voting purposes in Congress. So one side, North or South, couldn't outvote the other when big issues came up. And so you can see here, uh, Missouri is created as a slave state, so Maine is created as a free state, type thing, and to offset each other. And this line will become the dividing line between North and South, uh, free state, slave state, and these two sides start really arguing, and the arguments become bitter and resentful, and it's going to create a rift in this country that's not going to go away. It's not going to go away until after the Civil War. And so this is the implications of the Missouri Compromise. This is why it's important, because it's setting the stage for within 40 years a war. Okay, a civil war is going to break out, and the country will never be the same. All right, so from 1800 to 1830, this country will see a ton of growth. You start to see more and more immigration from Europe, uh, and you start to see really a divide between the North and the South. And not only did the Missouri Compromise of 1820 divide the North and the South, really, uh, you know, more than ever, but also the industrialization in the North and the slavery in the South kind of become the trademarks of both places. And so let's look at that. Industrialization is when industry starts to take over, factories and more technology starts to take over in a place. And in the early 1800s, the North really started to industrialize, build its factories, and uh, these become centers for people to work and to live around, and this is going to start to create or lead to the creation of larger cities, larger than we'd ever seen in the United States. Most people lived in pretty small towns before this, and many people continue to live in small towns after this, but where places become more industrialized and become centers of work and life, of course, then cities will spring up from that. So the North, it really, is going to be kind of the place to industrialize. Because more and more people were moving from their farms into the cities during this time of industrialization in the North, uh, they needed places to live. And so tenement apartments kind of become the thing. These are low cost, rundown apartments. Like I say, no luxury here. But this becomes kind of the place where many people that moved to cities live. Well, of course, most people were very poor back then. It was a day-to-day existence, and you know, very few people were wealthy. Um, and so, if you went to work in a factory, you moved from the farm, you took the family with you, uh, you moved into the city, you probably had to live in one of these tenement apartments. So while the North is industrializing more in the early 1800s, the South uh, is is still run by plantations. And a product and one thing in particular is going to make the South its money, and that's going to be cotton. Cotton is the big business. King cotton, it becomes known as, because cotton was king. Okay, if you wanted to make money as a plantation owner in the South, you grew cotton. Cotton was in high demand. They used the cotton to make clothing. It was it's breathable. It's much more comfortable than wool, which was the traditional fabric for clothing. And so cotton is in high demand, not only in the US, but over in Europe as well. And so the plantation owners that grew cotton, and of course their slaves out in the fields were the ones that picked the cotton. And that's that's crazy business, nasty business, picking cotton uh, all day, every day, backbreaking work. Uh, and and so, but that's how the money is made in the South. And so cotton was king. During this period of time as well, Andrew Jackson, a hero of the War of 1812, that's kind of where he made his name, wins the election of 1828 to become our president. He's bold, he's outspoken. You either loved him or you hated him. He was not shy about making his viewpoints known. He was strong-willed and stubborn and tough. As a kid, he'd had encounters during the Revolutionary War with British soldiers. Okay, um, and he was just a tough old frontiersman. And so, as president, he's going to do some things that are controversial. He's going to do some things that some people love and some people don't love. Okay, but he is he was a red-blooded American through and through, no doubt about that. And so Andrew Jackson will become our president. 1828, he will serve 2 terms, and he will kind of he kind of redefines the presidency. You had George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, uh, and some of those founding fathers, of course, early on, and then Jackson kind of redefines what it means to be the president and presidential power and authority. So that's Andrew Jackson. Now, let's look at the growth of the American West. The same time period, same overlapping time period as the industrialization and the cotton in the South. But this is really when America grows and moves to the West like never before. Of course, Lewis and Clark started out with their expedition in the very early 1800s, right? Um, And after that, bringing reports back to President Jefferson about the West and what it was like out there. Americans get word of this and they will start moving west. And so let's look at that right now. Some of the earliest Americans to live in the West were the mountain men. These guys were tough. They were rugged. These were trappers and traders. They lived in the Rocky Mountains of the modern day U.S. They lived in the territory we live in Utah and Colorado, in Idaho, places like that. And they lived in the mountains and trapped animals, uh, traded their furs and their pelts. These were some of the toughest, just absolutely just toughest, hardened guys you could ever imagine. Many of them died. I mean, this was a very dangerous job with Native Americans out there, with the animals out there, with the elements out there. Uh, but some of the earliest Americans, as well as other, obviously trappers and traders from Russia, from France, from England, you name it, all lived in the Rocky Mountain area. But some of the earliest Americans to live in that area were definitely the mountain men. Now, when kind of the mass migration starts to the west, it's the main overland route that people are going to take is going to be known as the Oregon Trail. Of course, Lewis and Clark went as far as modern day Oregon and mapped out things and reported on things all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And so Americans are going to try their hand at moving west. It's a 2,000-mile trip across the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains. It starts in Independence, Missouri, and it goes all the way to Oregon. Uh, Thousands and thousands of people are going to use this trail to get west. And of course, along the way, you're going to have some of the main monuments and forts that people set up for resting and resupplying and so forth. Some of these forts, like Laramie, um, Boise, of course, these are going to become cities today and major cities in their respective states. But this Oregon Trail was the classic team of oxen and covered wagon and families moving west and spending their life savings on these wagons and these oxen and these supplies to try their hand at a new life somewhere else where they could have their own land and carve out their own living, and it was going to be an adventure. And so this is how Americans really start going west. Now, you will see in a minute, eventually, there are all kinds of trails going to the west, not just to Oregon, but other places as well. But the Oregon Trail is the most famous of the trails. So, Oregon country, then, of course, the destination for this Oregon Trail kind of becomes the center of the action in the mid 1800s because the Oregon country technically goes from northern California um, all the way to southern Alaska at the time. This was it's now known as the Pacific Northwest, and so when American settlers start coming here, uh, they want to make this part of the U.S. And the issue is England controls uh, what is now, um, Canada, the parts of Canada to the west, and this area was disputed. Actually, Russia and Spain and England and the U.S. all wanted claim of at least parts of this area of the Oregon country, and so the United States makes a deal. We make another treaty with England, and we divide, or we set a dividing line at the 5440 line between British territory and American territory. And so the United States will end up with what is now Washington State and Oregon, and uh, and of course eventually we'll get California. We'll talk about that, how we get that from Mexico. But this is when the Oregon country kind of becomes part of the United States. And so, but yes, it's because of so many Americans moving in and saying, well, we need to make this part of the United States now, and it's kind of our destiny to do that, and you'll see that in just a minute as well. And here is the idea of destiny, manifest destiny. The belief that it was America's destiny and divine mission to spread democracy across the continent and control land from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And you can see this famous rendition, this famous painting of uh, Lady Liberty, and she's flying across the continent. And of course, from the east, it's already a little more established, and you can see it's the more light. And in the west, it's the dark clouds. It's darker. It's the unknown. But people are moving. They're trekking across the land. You have everything from covered wagons to stagecoaches to people on foot and people on horseback, and you know, eventually the trains, and but things are moving west. And so that's manifest destiny. It's America's, it's just it's its divine mission to go west and take its Christianity and take its American ideals of freedom and democracy and so forth, and that's the idea of manifest destiny. I alluded earlier to the different trails then, besides just the Oregon Trail, that settlers are going to use to move west. And you can see there are a bunch of them. There are a bunch of trails, but the Oregon Trail is the most famous. But you can see the Mormon Trail from Nauvoo, Illinois, which met up with the Oregon Trail for a while and then veered off into Salt Lake. The Santa Fe Trail, which started in Independence just like the Oregon Trail did, and went down south and ended up in Santa Fe, currently modern day New Mexico. The California Trail, which took basically the Oregon Trail all the way and veered off, and obviously went down into the San Francisco area. And so these trails, depending on where you wanted to end up, that's the trail you took, right? And so, but these trails are the ones that really start settling and populating what is now the Western United States. Now, as you look at this map, you can see that Spain is going to end up controlling, well, modern day Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, much of Colorado, part of Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, California. Spain controls the southwestern United States. And that had happened way back from when the conquistadors had come over and conquered the Aztecs in Mexico and then worked their way up into what is now the United States. And they were looking for gold. They were looking for prime land that could produce riches for them. And they didn't find their gold initially. Spain didn't, and so they kind of left the area and they didn't really colonize it. The irony is, of course, gold would be found in California and major amounts of it in Northern California in the mid 1800s. And but the Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish settlers never found it, and so they leave the land pretty much uh, just as is. They didn't colonize it, and except for, like I say on here, some Spanish missionaries who went up into California and into Texas and places like that and set up missions, Spanish missions that were kind of centers for preaching Christianity and trying to get the Native Americans from around the area to convert to Christianity and to the Spanish way of life. But by and large, Spain's commitment to holdings in the southwestern U.S. was pretty weak, uh, and they didn't do much with it. Well, eventually, Mexico, like the U.S. Before it, is going to win independence from its mother country. Just as we won independence from Great Britain, Mexico wins independence from Spain in 1821. These people that had lived in Mexico for many years uh, decided that they're Mexicans, they're not Spaniards, they're Mexicans, and they want to win their freedom, and they do in 1821. And so this is going to change now the dynamics of not only Mexico, but what is now the southwestern U.S. Because, as we'll see here in a second, not only does Mexico win its freedom from Spain and become its own independent nation, but Mexico now gets claim on all that land in the southwestern U.S. Once Mexico has it's all this new land, Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. Of course, they weren't known by that at that time, but by those names. But once they have all that land, Mexico says, well, we might as well make some money off it. There weren't very many people living in that area at the time. Not many Mexicans were living there, and so they said, well, we might as well make some money off it. So the government of Mexico encouraged settlement, not only of native Mexicans to move up there, but also of Americans in the United States to move into Mexican territory. And a guy that takes him up on the offer is Stephen F. Austin. Um, he will start leading American settlers into what is now Texas, Tejas, as the Mexicans called it, starting in 1822. And American families move in, they start colonizing and settling and working the land. And the Mexican government gave them tax breaks to move in and gave them free land, and of course they'd have to trade with Mexico, and they were taxed by Mexico, but they got breaks, like I said, with the taxes, and it was cheap land or free land, and in some cases, and so the Americans start moving in, and eventually a lot of Americans move in to Texas, and the Americans that live there way outnumber the Mexicans that live there, and this is going to raise an alarm to the Mexican dictator. That dictator was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And once so many Americans start moving into Texas, he says, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't anticipate this. I didn't think this was going to happen. I mean, I want Americans to move in, for the taxes and the trade, but now they outnumber the Mexicans that live there, like 10 to 1. And once the Americans have so many people in Texas, Americans start saying, well, maybe we should, maybe we as Americans should kind of take over this area and, make it ours. And of course, that is not going to go over well with Santa Anna. Well, one thing leads to another. Again, this is a review. One thing leads to another, and in 1835 and 1836, a Texas War for Independence occurs, the Texas Revolution. These Americans that lived in Texas didn't necessarily want to make Texas part of the United States at the time. They wanted to make Texas its own independent nation. They wanted Texas to be controlled by the Americans that lived there, and they wanted to make Texas its own entity. And so a war is fought over the course of a year for this Texas freedom. And you can see, of course, Santa Anna and the Mexican army is not gonna want this to happen. And so there are going to be some clashes, of course, famously at the Alamo and at Goliad and at San Jacinto. Let's look at that briefly. By the time of the Texas independence movement, Sam Houston is the leader. Sam Houston, of course, Houston, Texas is named after him. Sam Houston becomes the leader of the Texas army, if you will, and he is a tough old guy. He'd lived among natives as a kid. Uh, he knew how to fight. He was a brawler. He'd had some tragedy in his life with his family. He'd moved to Texas for a new start, and he was kind of seen as the leader of this revolution. Well, Texas, like I said, had numerous missions or kind of religious forts, if you will, that had been created by Spanish missionaries from years past. Of course, the most famous is in San Antonio, and it's the Alamo. Uh, this becomes the site of a major battle in the Texas War for Independence. There's 200 Americans that are there trying to hold this fort. Now, Sam Houston is not there at this time. He and the other part of the Texas Army are elsewhere in Texas, but people like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and William Travis are at the Alamo. And these 200 Americans will come up against 4,000 Mexicans led by Santa Anna. And these 4,000 Mexicans are there to squash any hopes the Texans have of independence. And so 4,000 against 200. The Americans hold out for 13 days from late February to early March of 1836. 13 days as the Mexican cannons are outside uh, the Alamo, shelling the fort, trying to get the Americans to surrender, and the Americans will not surrender. Finally, in early March of 1836, the fort is overrun. The Mexican soldiers breach the walls, and the fort is overrun, and all of the men inside, Every single one of them is killed. Uh, the There are just a few women and children who are allowed to live, and and then they witness, of course, this horrible scene of this massacre at the Alamo. And so, what's going to happen is word will get out about what happened at the Alamo, and it just makes the Texans infuriated. Okay, and so one thing leads to another, of course, and the Mexican army is weaving around through Texas, going from settlement to settlement, uh, trying to just squelch any rebellion, and eventually things come to a head. They come to a head at a place called San Jacinto, which is a river, and on an area by a river, uh, the Mexican army has arrived there thinking they are going to find Sam Houston and his Texas army, and Houston's not there. In fact, Houston has outsmarted Santa Anna and weaved around behind him. And by the time the Mexican army is uh, there waiting for a fight, they don't have one on their hands, and so they decide to take a rest, take a siesta. And Sam Houston and the Texas army surprise attacks them uh, and defeats Santa Anna and his army in March of 1836. They capture Santa Anna, and Sam Houston had the option of either killing him or negotiating, and so he gives Santa Anna that option, and Santa Anna decides to negotiate, and so the two sit down, and Santa Anna agrees that Texas can be now in American hands, and the Texans can be independent. And so the Republic of Texas is formed in 1836 after Sam Houston and Santa Anna negotiate here. And Sam Houston is elected the first president of Texas. Remember, Texas is its own country right now, and that's what they wanted. And Sam Houston is elected as his first president, and the Americans that live in Texas are, they're Texans, right? Of course, the flag of Texas, the Lone Star State, as it's called, uh, and Texas is its own nation. Texas stays its own nation for 9 years. Eventually, though, in 1845, it's annexed by the U.S. Texas becomes a state of the U.S. And this was mutually beneficial for both sides, for Texas and the U.S. And once the Texas becomes a state in the United States, of course, it's going to add to the strength and power and wealth of the United States, and it's going to really help things out. So, but yes, but Texas was its own country for 9 years, and then becomes a state in the U.S. Once it becomes a state, though, uh, another dispute arises. Texas claims its southern boundary, uh, and the U.S., I guess, and with Texas part of the U.S. now, claims that Texas' southern boundary with Mexico is the Rio Grande River. Mexico says the boundary is to the north, the Nueces River. And so there is an area in dispute between the Rio Grande and the Nueces going up north there that Texas and the U.S. claim, and that Mexico says, no, that's ours. And so this disputed area becomes a major source of contention. Both sides want it, the U.S. and Mexico. And instead of just talking things out, well, that's not going to be how it plays out. There's actually going to be a war. That disputed area leads to the Mexican War in 1846. And this is not much of a war. The U.S. crushes Mexico. You can see where the action took place, and Americans actually, the American military actually goes down into Texas, uh, hammers the Mexicans down there, crushes any opposition, and captures Santa Anna again. And now the Americans have the option again. Well, Santa Anna, we could kill you, or you can negotiate with us. And so Santa Anna again decides to negotiate. And because of the negotiation, you will see what ends up happening. The United States is going to majorly increase the size of its country again. At the same time that the Mexican War is going on down in Texas and in Mexico, uh, Americans revolt in California against Mexico and set up a republic. Um, California. California becomes a state in 1850. So Mexico just can't control. They can't control the holdings that they had in the American Southwest. Is really what it comes down to. The Americans that moved into these areas just outnumber the Mexicans that in these areas, and the Mexican government going up against the American government is just it's really just it's no match for the American government at this time. And so uh, the Americans crushed Mexico in the Mexican War, and then the Americans in California at the same time set up the Republic of California. So what is the result of all this? Well, the result is Santa Anna, forced to negotiate rather than lose his life, uh, agrees to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. It officially ends the Mexican War. Now, the U.S. actually pays Mexico $15 million, which didn't necessarily have to. We won the war, but we pay Mexico 15 million bucks. And for the Mexican part of the deal, for us, they agree that we will get the modern day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, part of Colorado, part of Wyoming, and part of New Mexico, which had all been Mexican territory before. And so the U.S., like I said, vastly increases the size of its holdings as a result of this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. A few years later, we will add the rest of what is now Arizona and part of New Mexico with what's called the Gaston Purchase. You can see there in the light brown on the bottom of the page. But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican War, and the U.S. gets all this territory. And then to reinforce, here is the Gadsden Purchase. 5 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexican government sells parts of Arizona and New Mexico for $10 million to us. And so you can just see that the United States is just increasing its size over time. So here's the map then. And basically then, by 1853, the United States has all of what we now know as the continental U.S. From the original 13 colonies to uh, the treaty after the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, which gives us all of, from Alabama to Michigan and Wisconsin, to the Louisiana Purchase, to the Texas War for Independence, and then the annexation of Texas by the U.S., to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the Mexican War, and as well as the Northwest Territory in the Pacific Northwest. You can see the U.S. basically its current size, the continental U.S. That's how it comes to be. So pretty crazy, but manifest destiny, right? Is it a real thing? Well, it ended up being a real thing because eventually the United States went from coast to coast, Atlantic to Pacific, and of course eventually we'll add Alaska and Hawaii as states, but the United States grows and grows and grows and becomes what it is today. Of course, no study of the American West would be complete without talking about Brigham Young and the Mormon Pioneers. Brigham Young led the Mormon Pioneers west to the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. He's known as the Great Colonizer because not only did the Mormons settle in the Salt Lake Valley, but Young sends Mormon settlers out to all kinds of places throughout Idaho and into California and Arizona, and the Mormons form communities all over the place throughout the West. Of course, living here in Utah, we got to study, famous events in Utah. Well, Utah, from the time the pioneers came here in 1847, they want statehood over time. They appeal to the United States for statehood, but that is continually denied. And for 49 years, they do not become a state. They're just a territory until 1896. And and in 1896, Utah becomes the 45th state. Here's a picture of the celebration for statehood, a parade in downtown Salt Lake City in 1896. Kind of cool. But the U.S. finally admits Utah as a state in 1896. Well, let's go back. Let's go back. What made the Californians, what made the Americans in California, uh, you know, want statehood and really rise up against the Mexican government and take over California? Um, Really, what happens is, of course, the Mexican War was going on, and the Americans in California at the time were agitating for statehood or for independence, I should say, uh, at that time. But right as the Mexican War is ending, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed. Um, the fate of California and the fortunes of California change dramatically. And what ends up happening is John Sutter, who is a Swiss immigrant living in California, he owned land. He wanted a sawmill to um, to be built and on his land on a river. And the man working and building this mill discovers gold in 1848. Of course, discoveries of gold were not kept secret for very long. Word gets out, and pretty soon people start flooding onto John Sutter's land looking for gold. And some people find it. And then more people flood onto his land looking for gold, and more people find it. Uh, and this leads to the California Gold Rush that will reach its height in 1849. Of course, poor John Sutter, people flood onto his land, overrun his land. He basically loses, his holdings, and thousands, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of people will flood into California and throughout the West looking for gold. And most people don't find much, if any, but some people do find some gold, and some people find a lot. And so the California Gold Rush becomes the thing, okay, for people to do, not only from all over the U.S. and from the East Coast, okay, moving out to California, but from China as well. People from China flood in to California looking for gold, and you name it, people from all over the place were trying to find their fortunes and strike it rich quick in California, and it's on John Sutter's land. They do that. Just to give you an idea of how many people came to California, California had about 15,000 residents in 1848. And by 1849, because of the gold rush, the population was 100,000. And of course, it would just increase after that. Today, of course, California is the most populous state in the U.S., but it really got its start as becoming the most populous during this gold rush. It really that's kind of the impetus of this whole flooding into California. So uh, the because of the gold rush reaching its height in 1849, well, you can probably guess what the people who flooded to California were called. They were called 49ers, right? The nickname for the people who rushed to California looking for gold. The 49ers, just like the football team, because the gold rush was up in Northern California by the San Francisco area, and of course, then the San Francisco football team is called the 49ers. But I love this picture because you can see you got some Americans, you have some Chinamen, uh, people of all nationalities, all over from different areas of the world, converged on California, looking for gold. All right, now events leading to the Civil War. So we're looking from 1850 to 1861. The during this time, of course, the U.S. had expanded. We'd had, the Mexican War. We'd had the Northwest Territory. We'd the gold rush was happening, had happened, was happening, and now you have the focus on the the tensions between the North and the South. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, free states, slave states, that came into sharp focus again during this time. And let's look at the events that lead to the bloodiest war in U.S. history. The key difference, obviously, between the North and the South in the mid 1800s was slavery. Again, the North saw slavery as an abomination. It's inhumane. How could you do this? The North didn't allow slavery. The South said, no, no, no. It's not inhumane at all. We're just one big happy family down here. We all get along. We all get, and the North said, well, why don't you, why don't you ask your slaves if they'd like to be free? See what they say. And so the North and the South just couldn't come to an agreement over this. And the South said, hey, if you keep pushing us on this slavery issue, we're gonna fight you over it. We'll have a war before we give up our slaves. Well, that's exactly what they had. It's during this time that a housewife from the North named Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's a fictional book, of course, about slavery and being a Northerner. Of course, she's going to demonize slavery and say how bad it is, and and this book sells like crazy. In fact, it becomes the best-selling book after the Bible in the United States at the time, and uh, and of course, Northerners would read this and say, "See, we told you, slavery is just evil. It's so bad. How can you do this?" And the Southerners would read this and say, "No, no, no. This she's got it all wrong. It's a misrepresentation and it's inaccurate." And so it just increases the tensions between the North and the South. It just increases the animosity over the issue of slavery between the North and the South. What further increases tensions between the North and the South is this man, John Brown. John Brown believed it was his duty to end slavery in the United States. He believed he had been called by God to end slavery, end this evil practice once and for all. And so John Brown's going to take matters into his own hands, as you will see. He first goes into Kansas, which is an interesting thing because Kansas is actually a territory that allows slavery in some places and doesn't allow it in others. Kind of weird, but Kansas had its pro-slavery uh, government um, and its anti-slavery government. Okay, pro-slavery government was in Lecompton, and just up the river in Topeka was the anti-slavery government. And so you had all kinds of fights between 1855 and 1856 between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. You can see in on May 21st, 1856, a pro-slavery mob burns buildings in an abolitionist town in Lawrence, Kansas, the site of the modern-day University of Kansas. Just a few days later, in response to this, on May 24th, abolitionist John Brown and his sons murder 5 pro-slavery settlers at the Potawatomi Massacre. And so because of this, blood is shed. This is called Bleeding Kansas, this period of time. And Kansas becomes kind of the epicenter of this struggle between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in the United States. Then, after leaving Kansas, John Brown descends on Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Now, Harpers Ferry is the site of a federal weapons arsenal, a place where they keep weapons. And John Brown and his sons plan to raid this arsenal, capture the weapons, uh, seize the weapons, have slaves from the area in Virginia also help them do this, arm the slaves, and then have the slaves stage a revolution or a revolt against their slave owners in Virginia. And I don't know exactly how he thought he was going to carry out this plan successfully, but this is his plan. And so he and his sons do perform a raid on the federal arsenal. It's actually very poorly defended. And so his sons and he get in to the arsenal. They actually do capture, seize some weapons. But by the time they do this, word has gotten out, and a uh, a U.S. military force led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later become the main Confederate general in the Civil War, uh, stop John Brown and his sons from doing anything more. They surround the arsenal. They capture John Brown and his sons. Uh, his Some of his sons are killed. John Brown is captured, and he is um, eventually he's he is put on trial, accused of treason. He's going to be found guilty of treason, and he will be executed. And so that is the end of John Brown. But the issue now becomes how John Brown is seen by the American people. In the North, he is, by a lot of people, kind of revered as a martyr to the cause. He's a hero. In the South, he is going to be demonized. He's the devil, right? And so again, John Brown furthers this division between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery ideas in the United States. And so here again is a picture of the Missouri Compromise. And you're supposed to have this line between North and South, free state, slave state. And but this is going to be called into question because so you have Harriet Beecher Stowe with her Uncle Tom's Cabin. You have John Brown and his actions, and with trying to end slavery on his own. And then you have this. In 1857, the Supreme Court rules on the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott had been a slave in Missouri, which was a slave state, but his owner had taken him to the north for a while and kept him as a slave, which was illegal. Slavery wasn't supposed to be allowed in the north. And then they'd moved back to Missouri, and he was back in a slave state again. Well, Dred Scott sues for his freedom, saying, "Wait a minute here. I was treated as a slave up in the north, where that's prohibited, and I should be a free man." And so his lawsuit gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in 1857 against Dred Scott, effectively saying that slavery apparently can exist in the North. It can exist anywhere in the U.S. Of course, the South celebrates. The North is absolutely irate. They cannot believe the Supreme Court did this. And this doesn't cause the Civil War, but all of these things, Uncle Tom's Cabin, John Brown, the Dred Scott decision, all of them just increase tensions, increase animosities between North and South, and perhaps speed up the beginning of the Civil War. And then kind of the final straw is this. Well, the Republican Party is a new political party formed in 1854. They oppose slavery. That's kind of one of their main ideas, and they're opposed to slavery, whereas the Democrats, who dominated the South, by and large, are in favor of slavery. Well, in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposes slavery, is going to be running for office, and he will be elected. And his election, like I say, is kind of the final straw in all of these events leading up to the Civil War, because Lincoln, as a Republican, you're going to see in just a minute, he's going to win this election that the South is going to be just they can't believe this happened. The South is so upset. But Lincoln getting elected in 1860 is, as the first Republican president, is really kind of the nail in the coffin. Here is a map of the election of 1860, and here the picture. I love that photo of him, pre-beard. Right? We're not used to seeing Abraham Lincoln without his beard, but there's a pre-beard photo of Lincoln. But here's the map. What happens is there are four guys running in 1860, and Lincoln wins all the states in the North, as well as Oregon and California, which are relatively new states. But he wins all the states in the North where most of the population is. Okay, you can see John Bell won a few states there as well, and Stephen Douglas won a couple states, and John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, won most of the South. But because the population is mostly in the North, and Lincoln wins all the states in the North, obviously with New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Massachusetts, right? Lincoln carries the electoral vote. He wins, and he wins the election. Well, the South cannot believe this. They're just irate. They say, wait a minute here. How can a guy win the presidency without any votes from the South? If a president can win, uh, this election with no votes from the South, no electoral votes from the South, well, then maybe the South's votes don't matter. Maybe they don't really count for that much. And if they don't matter that much, maybe we, the South, shouldn't be part of the U.S. anymore. Maybe we should break off and form our own country where our votes will matter. And this is kind of their mode of thinking. And so, of course, Lincoln and the North is like, no, what are you talking about? You can't do that. This is an election, and this is how things work. And no, but the South says, no, no, we are serious about this, and we're going to take some action. And so, because of Lincoln's election, and the South just unwilling to accept that he could get elected with none of the Southern votes, the South begins secession. Uh, the the states secede, break off from the United States, and form their own country. And it kind of just crazy to think that could happen, but this is exactly what occurs. And so the South will, you can see all the states that seceded, uh, and they're all in the kind of the reddish and the pink, okay, and they will be called the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy for short. And so this is how it starts, okay? When the South secedes, they become kind of their own version of kind of a different version of the United States. The South elects their own president named Jefferson Davis. They create their own flag. They create their own currency. They have their own Congress. They have basically everything, okay, that the United States had. They just use that as a blueprint. And so, of course, the South considers what they have done to be legitimate. Yeah, we can do this. We have states' rights. We have freedom to break off. And the North says, no, you can't do that. And Abraham Lincoln says, this is crazy. You guys can't constitutionally break off and form your own nation. Okay, it's unconstitutional. It's not, you just can't do this. And the South says, well, we have done it. Not only can we do it, we did it, and that's that. And so Lincoln will always consider himself to be the president of not only the North, but the South as well, because he considers what the South did to be illegal and unconstitutional. But the South does not consider Lincoln to be its president. They have their own president, Jefferson Davis. And so there's going to be no reconciliation in this argument and in this conflict except for war. Okay, war is going to be the only way around this, and that's exactly what's going to happen. The Civil War starts at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. This is a United States fort, but because South Carolina has seceded, South Carolina says no, this fort belongs to the Confederacy, and the North says no, it does not. And so the first shots of the Civil War fired here in April of 1861 over who will control Fort Sumter. And now the Civil War is on. The Civil War between North and South, Union and Confederacy, American against American, father against son in some cases, brother against brother. This war will be the bloodiest in U.S. history because pretty much every casualty is an American. It's going to go for 4 years, 4 long, bloody years. And it's going to redefine, of course, the future of America. And it's going to redefine what America is about. And so every so often throughout American history, you have these times that redefine the country and make Americans reflect on what we really believe and what we stand for. And the Civil War is definitely one of those redefining times. The two sides in the Civil War, as mentioned, are the Union and the Confederacy. The Union uh, with their blue uniforms, the Confederacy with their gray uniforms, and this is how they're going to be known for these 4 years. As the war gets going, the North on paper looked like they had all the advantages, or at least most of them. The North had probably double or around double the population. It already had an established army and navy. Uh, The North had double the railroad track. It had most of the factories producing most of the goods. It had double the economy uh, that the South did. And so the North seemed to have, kind of things in its favor. But the South had a couple of advantages too of its own that really helped out. Those strengths included, of course, most of the battles, at least at first, are going to be fought on Southern soil. And so the South is going to be fighting for its way of life, to preserve its way of life. Uh, right or wrong, the South is going, it's fighting for, uh, you know, its ideals. Uh, the South also had 7 out of the 8 military schools that were in the country at the time uh, in its territory. So the only military school in the North was West Point, the modern day headquarters of the U.S. Army. But 7 out of those 8 military schools in the U.S. at the time were in the South. And therefore, the South had better trained military officers. And this is going to show through the Civil War. I mean, definitely the South is going to have the advantage with its officers. They're in general much better, and and just they make better decisions than the northern officers do, and they're more strategic, and so the South has the advantage militarily in that way. Although the North had more troops, the South is going to have better officers. The Civil War is also going to see some quote unquote new weapons, uh, bullet shaped ammunition. Whereas in the Revolutionary War, you were still using the musket ball. A musket ball, of course, isn't as accurate, doesn't fly as far, drifts in the wind. The bullet shaped ammunition is going to spin through the barrel of a gun, and it's going to fly straighter and farther uh, than a musket ball. Better guns, better rifles in the Civil War than we had previously had as well. Uh, we had these shells that would be shot out of cannons and explode uh, when they hit the ground and send uh, metal shrapnel flying everywhere, which would do immense damage. You even had a thing called canisters, which were shells that would be shot out of cannons, but the canisters were filled with bullets. And so when the canister hit the ground and blew up, you not only had flying shrapnel, but you also had flying bullets. And you can imagine the damage that would do. And so these quote unquote new and improved weapons are going to do more damage, of course, than ever before. The Southern or Confederate lead general throughout the war was Robert E. Lee. He was probably the best general on either side during the war. And he was a Virginia guy. President Lincoln, on the eve of the Civil War, offered him the top Union general position, and he said, I'm a Southern boy. I'm from Virginia. Even though I'm opposed to slavery personally, but I got to fight for my South. Okay, and so Robert E. Lee took that Confederate position. Uh, it's because he was so good that that the war lasts as long as it does. Like I said, the South had better generals than the North, and because of that, the war goes on longer than it probably should have, with all the North's advantages. This is a review of the war, so I'm going to skip over quite a few of the individual battles and things like that. But um, the war goes back and forth for the first couple of years, and President Lincoln, while opposed to slavery, wasn't quite sure he had the authority to end it. And at least at first, and then about halfway through the Civil War, he says, we've got to do something. We got to do something drastic. And so he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Uh, it declares all slaves in areas of rebellion, which were the Confederacy, to be free. Now, the North sees this as a really great move on his part. The South doesn't care, though. At least the Southern white slave owners don't care because they don't consider Lincoln to be their president anyway. And so when he issues this proclamation, they don't pay much attention to it. But the Northern armies that are working their way through the South and fighting battles in the South are the ones that really, say, hey, slaves, come off your plantations. Your president, Lincoln, up north, has said you're free. And so this is really what this really gives it kind of a little bit of a boost, I guess, of morale to Northerners and maybe to the Union Army, and certainly to African Americans who were enslaved in the South that find out about this. Some of who are able to get off their plantations and even join the Union Army and help fight for their own freedom. So this is a big deal, of course, in U.S. history because this shows that Lincoln especially just he says we have to end slavery. This is ridiculous. We got to get this thing, you know, uh, finished once and for all. And speaking of African Americans who fought for the Union, now there were quite a few free blacks from the North who joined the Union Army, but also ex-slaves from the South. Uh, well, people that escaped slavery from the South that joined the Union Army. Um, by the end of the war, about 180,000 black troops, or 10% of the entire Union Army, was African American. So, 180,000 troops. Not all of them were allowed to fight. Some were, some were not. But I mean, that's a huge boost to your army. When you have 10% of your army being African American, and that's a big help. And some of these African American soldiers proved to be as good as any other soldier, and they were a tremendous help to the Union Army. We've already mentioned how the North had most of the factories, most of the industrialization. Uh, the northern factories were going day and night, producing uh, guns and ammunition and resources for the Union Army to use, and so this is a huge advantage as well. A couple of guys who ran their factories and made a fortune during the Civil War were people like uh, Philip Armour, who figured out how to package meat and keep it preserved a little longer, and then they could send that to the Union troops, and they'd have a source of protein there, and a food source that was a little better than maybe they would have otherwise. Samuel Colt weapons, Colt guns. Uh, Samuel Colt kept his factories running day and night, and like I said, he made a fortune off of supplying the Union Army with their weapons. And so the money to be had during the Civil War was there for factory and industry owners who worked with the United States government. Something also that changes during the Civil War is the healthcare. Healthcare was so primitive uh, before the Civil War, and even during the Civil War, it remained fairly primitive. But a couple women came along to kind of revamp things a little bit, especially for the Union Army. Clara Barton being one of them, she provided supplies and first aid to Union troops. She would later be instrumental in forming the American Red Cross. Dorothea Dix organized and led Union nursing corps, and what these people realized is, you know, the old way of doing things was barbaric. A guy gets shot in the leg, they'd take a saw to him and cut off the part of the leg that was damaged. uh, and then they'd use the same saw or the same needles on people all day long and without cleaning anything. Of course, infections uh, would occur because you're using dirty and contaminated equipment on multiple people throughout a day, and so infections would occur, and more guys end up dying of infections and disease than ended up dying of the wounds of battle themselves. And so these women tried to come along and help with that and try to revamp some of that and realize, hey, you got to clean equipment, and you got to do things. I mean, things that we think are standard today, things that we look at as just just standard procedure, that wasn't always followed back then. And so you can imagine you know how bad that was, and how many guys got sick or died from the infections that resulted from the lack of hygiene, lack of cleanliness of just the materials. So these women have really helped change that. Well, just over halfway through the war, the turning point of the war, the biggest battle of the war occurs at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Both um, the Union and Confederate armies meet at Gettysburg, and a 3-day battle, July 1st through 3rd of 1863. The Union will end up winning this battle, but you can see the casualties: 23,000 dead, wounded, or missing Union troops, and 28,000 dead, wounded, or missing Confederate troops in 3 days. So over 50,000 men dead, wounded, or missing in a 3-day battle. After this battle, the Union will have the upper hand, and they already have more troops. They outnumber the Confederate troops. They always have, but the Union is now on its way to victory. The Confederacy is going to be on its heels after this, and this the battle swings because of a couple major incidents. One of those being Pickett's charge, and this was kind of the death blow for the Confederacy. It was the 3rd day of the battle, and the Union troops are kind of on one hill across a valley, and the Confederate troops are on the other hill across the valley from each other, and from both sides from each other. And General Pickett kind of lost his cool. He lost his patience, and he decides to charge with 15,000 troops toward the Union stronghold at Cemetery Ridge, and he and those 15,000 troops are just going to get bombarded with cannon fire, with sniper fire, with just gunfire in general. And coming across that open field in their lines and columns, they're going to get mowed down. And losing that many troops, or losing so many troops as they did during that Pickett's charge, is there's no way to recover for the Confederacy from this, and the Confederacy will lose this battle of Gettysburg because of this. And so Gettysburg, like I said, is the turning point. The Union is on the march, and the Confederacy is going to be on its heels as a result. Because of what happened at Gettysburg and the magnitude, the enormity of it, and the Battle of Gettysburg, of course, was in the summer of 1863, but a few months later, President Lincoln is going to show up at Gettysburg with the purpose of dedicating the cemetery, the battlefield and the cemetery there, to remember what happened, and to give a speech. And his speech literally lasts about 2 minutes. The story goes that there's a famous orator at the time in the United States, and this guy was going to be there as well, and he got up and spoke for 2 hours. And then it was Lincoln's turn, and Lincoln got up and spoke for about 2 minutes. And he gave the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, of course, it starts out. And he talks about the battle. He talks about the war itself. He talks about American freedom and liberty, and how we have to preserve these things. And he finishes by saying that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. And he sits down. And that famous orator looked at him and said, you said more in 2 minutes than I said in 2 hours. And, at the time, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address wasn't nearly as revered as it is today, but today it's gone down as, of course, one of the great speeches in American history. He summarized and encapsulated things so succinctly and so precisely in just a couple of minutes. It's amazing. But powerful speech to dedicate what had happened at Gettysburg, and just kind of Gettysburg was just, an example of how massive of a deal this Civil War was. And that hallowed ground at Gettysburg you can still visit today, and it's quite a sight. Well, by 1864, 1865, like I said, the South is on its heels and the North has the upper hand. And the war will really get finished off by General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman of the Union. And as he marches and cuts his path toward the sea, as they call it, General Sherman and the Union Army is now in the South. deep south, and they're in Atlanta. They destroy Atlanta. They burn much of the city, and they will march toward the sea, toward Savannah, Georgia, and from there up through South Carolina and into North Carolina, uh, just annihilating everything in their path, uh, trouncing over fields and destroying livestock and destroying roads and bridges and burning cities, you name it. And so, as you can imagine, to this day, General Sherman's not too popular in the South, but his he blames the South for this war. He said this war wouldn't have happened if not for these Southerners and their, uh, you know, really just their stubbornness and the the illegality of what they did by breaking away. And he blames all the woes of the war on the South, and so he's going to make them pay as the war finishes up, and he does make them pay. And so General Sherman's march to the sea is kind of the final blow uh, for the South, ensuring the North's victory. Well, President Lincoln still has to run for re-election in 1864, and he's not sure he's going to win. He should have been sure. He won easily, but he wasn't sure he was going to win. And so um, you can see by the map here, he won in a landslide. But and in fact, he was running against McClellan, who had been his lead general for the Union twice. He'd hired him and fired him twice as head general for the Union. But Lincoln wins election in 1864, and because he wasn't sure he was going to win, he chose the only Southern politician that stayed in the North after secession, and that was Andrew Johnson. Lincoln did that thinking, well, if I pick this Southern guy, maybe anybody you know, who doesn't like me, from the North, maybe they'll vote for me anyway because of him. And this is going to come back to haunt the U.S. later on because of what happens to Lincoln, obviously, with his assassination. But Lincoln wins election in 1864 and wins easily. And once he wins re-election, now he is free to get Congress, and and Congress, of course, is willing to do this, and Lincoln's going to sign it. The 13th Amendment. Lincoln signs off on this in a heartbeat. The 13th Amendment is going to be added to the Constitution, which outlaws slavery in the U.S. Now, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation prior to this, obviously, a couple years earlier, but it didn't really have the effect ultimately until the North wins the war. And so Lincoln now says, we're going to win the war. The war is almost over. The 13th Amendment needs to be passed, outlawing slavery and forced servitude forever in the United States. And so this is, of course, one of the great things that Lincoln did. Realizing there was no way to win the war at this point, General Robert E. Lee, still commander of the Confederate armies, uh, has no choice but to surrender. He and his armies meet up with General Ulysses S. Grant, who's now the top commander of the Union armies, uh, at a place called Appomattox in Virginia. April 9th, 1865, Lee and Grant meet inside the McLean House in Appomattox. This is the site of the Civil War surrender. It was basically a family called the McLeans who were living there. And can you imagine getting a knock at your door from General Grant and General Lee and saying, "Hey, can we use your front room for a few hours? We're gonna sign some surrender papers." And so the two sides met. Lee and Grant were very cordial to each other. Grant was was younger than Lee, and Lee, of course, he's basically said, "I'd rather die 1,000 deaths than have to surrender," at this point. But he had no choice. His troops were those that were left they were out of food and they were exhausted and out of supplies in general, and they couldn't keep fighting. And the North could have kept fighting longer. They had some supplies, they had more troops, and the South realized they just had no choice, and so but to surrender. And so Lee surrenders, and Grant and the Union were very gracious in their surrender terms. They said, "Look, we're not going to hold any of you guys as traitors or anything. We're not going to shoot anybody. In fact, here's a bunch of food. Tell your men, to turn around and go home and go back to their go back to their families and to become Americans again. We're all Americans. We're not Union or Confederate. We're Americans and we're brothers. And so that is what happens. And that is how the Civil War comes to a close after 4 years of this titanic struggle. And so, you know, I guess it ended on good terms as far as, the sides were cordial with each other, but it's going, because of how it ends and because of the war itself, there's going to be a lot of lasting bitterness in the country, as you can imagine. And the country is going to be thrown into another upheaval. Even though the war is over, the country is going to have another tragedy with the Lincoln assassination. That Lincoln assassination occurs at the hands of a man named John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a famous actor of the day. He came from an acting family, and his brother was an actor, his dad had been an actor. And Booth was known throughout the U.S., but he was a Southern sympathizer. He did not want the war to end. He wanted the South to somehow keep fighting and win the war. He wanted slavery to continue. And John Wilkes Booth and some men that agree with his ideology decide they are going to assassinate the president. And the plan actually was to assassinate Lincoln as well as other leading Americans on the same night at the same time, kind of a coordinated effort. And long story short, though, John Wilkes Booth finds out there's going to be a play. Of course, he's an actor. He knows all the ins and outs of the theaters. He knows the backstages and the secret passageways. He knows the theaters inside and out. And he hears that at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., there's going to be a play that night called Our American Cousin. President Lincoln's going to attend with his wife and a couple of guests. And Booth decides he's going to assassinate the president at that point. And so, kind of crazy story, though. There were supposed to be guards on duty. Supposed to be a guard on duty at the top of the stairs leading to the presidential suite, at the balcony there where Lincoln was sitting. And that guard decided, nothing was going to happen that night. It was all good. And so he went to the tavern across the street and started drinking a little bit and left the door unattended. Well, Booth goes up and the door is unlocked. And Booth opens the door, and he knew, of course, the play that they were watching. He knew when people would be clapping and when they would be laughing and so forth. The play was a comedy, and so he waited till a moment when the crowd was going to be loud, and he sneaks up right behind President Lincoln and shoots him right behind the left ear, right in the head. Well, Lincoln goes down, and he is not dead, but he is unconscious. His wife, Mary, screams. And now the crowd kind of looks up and what's going on. And there's a struggle between Lincoln's guest, Major Rathbone, he was named, and he struggles with John Wilkes Booth. Well, Booth had a single shot gun, and so Booth pulls out a knife and struggles with Rathbone and stabs him, but he ends up being okay. And then Booth, from the balcony with the crowd kind of like, what's going on? Is this part of the play? What's happening here? Booth jumps down from the balcony onto the stage, breaks his leg, flashes the knife at the crowd. The crowd kind of gasps and oohs and ahs, and Booth limps off the stage, goes backstage where he had, backstage and out the back door where he had a horse waiting for him, gets on his horse and rides off into the Virginia countryside. And from there, about a week and a half or 2 weeks of a manhunt ensue, looking for Booth and his other conspirators who actually did some things to other people that night. And they eventually find Booth, who they believe was John Wilkes Booth, cooped up inside a barn in the Virginia countryside, and federal authorities surrounded that barn, and there was a shootout that ensued, and they set the barn on fire, and they believe that Booth, well, let's put it this way, Nobody came out of that barn alive, and so they believe that John Wilkes Booth was either shot and killed inside the barn, or or the fire got him. But one way or another, they believe they got Booth, and that was the end of the manhunt. But the damage had been done. Lincoln was dead. He, in fact, died the next morning uh, in a house across the street where they had taken him after he was shot, and he never did regain consciousness, and he passed away. And so now that he is gone, the nation is in shock. The nation is in mourning, at least certainly the North, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, now becomes the president. Now, Andrew Johnson, as president, taking over for Lincoln, uh, this is going to be a disaster for the country because Johnson is, as mentioned, a Southerner who was fairly sympathetic toward slavery and Southern ideas, uh, but he had stayed in the North during the Civil War as a politician. Lincoln got him to be his vice president. And now Johnson, as president, is, he's fairly racist. Uh, he's not, let's put it this way, not unsympathetic towards Southern ways of life. And this nation has to be put back together now. After 4 years of bloody conflict, the North has prevailed, but the South is bitter. And we have all these people now that had been slaves in the South that are no longer slaves due to the 13th Amendment and the North victory in the war. And so people look to Johnson for leadership and say, well, okay, you got to restore this country, and you got to what's going to happen now? And he was just not the guy for the job. Lincoln would have been the guy for the job, but Johnson was not. And it's going to be tough. We're going to go through some tough years after the Civil War, not only because of the lasting bitterness that a lot of Southerners harbored uh, because of this war, not only because of all the death and destruction during the war, but because we had a real lack of leadership in Washington, D.C. as well. So the United States is restored, technically put back together, or at least in name, put back together after the war. But what problems are ahead? Well, there will be a few. And our final chapter of study for this review is Reconstruction. After the Civil War, trying to rebuild the nation from 1865 to 1877. Andrew Johnson is president. Of course, there was the poster for the Lincoln Johnson ticket in 1864. Johnson is president and he will oversee this Reconstruction, at least the beginning of the Reconstruction period. One of the problems that he's going to face, and unfortunately not do a whole lot about, is that a lot of the southern states already upset at losing the war, upset about losing their slaves, because these slaves are now free people. These southern states are going to implement laws that are going to be known as black codes. These really are things put into place to limit black freedoms at a time when African Americans should have had more freedoms than they ever experienced and should have really been treated equally with everyone else. Their freedoms got limited right off the bat because these southern states put these on the books. And so, for example, uh, one of the new freedoms that blacks had was that you could get married, right? You could get married to who you wanted, and but the black code in the South was, well, you can only marry other blacks if you're black. No interracial marriages. Another thing was blacks can now travel freely, right? They're free people. They can travel freely. The black code was if you travel on a train, you have to travel in the luggage or baggage car of the train. You can't get a seat. Okay. The freedom was blacks can sue now in court. The black code, well, the judge and jury is all going to be white. So things like that, right? They should have been free. They should have been equal, but they were not given that true equality. So what do people do for work now? Now that they are free, what do African Americans do to earn a living? Uh, Many of them had to resort to sharecropping. Sharecropping, now this was not only a lot of African Americans, but there's a lot of poor whites as well in the South after the war. But sharecropping was a system in which a farmer uses a portion the of a planter's land and receives a share of the crop at harvest time as payment. So, the landowners still owned their land in the South. And so a lot of these slaves that, who'd been on their own land, previous to the war, even during the war, a lot of these people now that are free, these free blacks come back and say, "Hey, can I work on your land?" And so you had basically a landowner or a landlord would say, "Yes, you guys can work on my land. This family gets this portion of the land. This family can work on that portion of the land, and so forth." And then at harvest time, uh, you give me a portion of the crop as payment, and you can keep the other portion of the crop. Well, the problem was, these people are super poor, and so they need tools. Well, you got to buy the tools from the landlord, and there's rent, to be on the land, so to speak. And so what would happen is oftentimes the the sharecroppers never could make enough money or never could get enough of the harvest um, to actually pay off their debts to the landlord. And so they're stuck on that land. They may be stuck on that land the rest of their life, just eking out a meager existence. And so sharecropping was kind of a way of life for a lot of ex slaves and a lot of poor whites after the Civil War in the South. For those sharecroppers who could make a little bit and could work their way out of sharecropping, the step above that was called tenant farming. You can see here a system of farming in which a farmer rents land from a planter and uses it however he or she desires. So this, like I said, step above, right? So the landlord would say, okay, yes, you can have this, you can work on this part of the land. Whatever you grow is yours, the whole thing. Um, or however you want to use the land, it's up to you. Now you do owe me rent to live on the land and to work it, work on the land. But whatever you decide to do with the land and whatever you grow is all yours. And so this was a better system than sharecropping because there was a little more of a living to be made, a little more money to be made doing this. So it was better than sharecropping, but still wasn't great. But black and white, you know, uh, black and white both, tried to work out of sharecropping and work up to tenant farming. One of the major focuses of Reconstruction was not only are you reconstructing or rebuilding the country, putting it back together, you're rebuilding the different aspects of individual places. You're having to rebuild homes and bridges and roads and you name it, right? But you're also rebuilding things like the railroad, which in the South had been largely destroyed by Union armies coming through. They'd twist and bend the tracks and put them out of commission, and things. So um, rebuilding the railroad in the South and also continuing to build the railroad across the entire country was a major focus of Reconstruction. They wanted to build a railroad coast to coast, which eventually they did 4 years after the Civil War ends. But just like in the North, small southern towns became big cities because of the railroad, which was the focus of Reconstruction here. Places like Richmond and Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, Little Rock, Montgomery, Charlotte, Dallas, Houston were places that were small towns relatively, and when they became kind of railroad hubs or railroad stops after the railroad was rebuilt in the South, they start to grow, right? And people are going to want to be where the goods and the services are and where the goods and services stop through. And so these towns become cities. And of course, today, these are major cities in our country. One of the really bad sides of Reconstruction was the Ku Klux Klan. It starts in the South after the Civil War. It starts, again, by, you know, kind of as a social club in Tennessee, and from there it'll spread throughout the South. Uh, it's it's going to be, people who are upset at losing the Civil War, people who are bitter, disaffectioned. Uh, they're going to take out their anger. They're upset that they lost their Southern way of life, that they lost their slavery, And so they're going to target African Americans and anybody who's supportive of African Americans. And they're going to have their rallies, and they're going to intimidate and beat people up, and at times kill people. And so the KKK will exist for a while. And unfortunately, people like President Johnson and later President Grant and things, they don't put an end to this. And it lasts for a little while. Eventually, it'll kind of not disappear, but kind of dissipate and kind of go underground and for a number of decades, a few decades, until it resurfaces in the 1900s. But the KKK is definitely a part of our history that it's hard to talk about, but it is part of our history nonetheless, and it starts after the Civil War. To finish up, then, there were some successes to Reconstruction, rebuilding this country, putting it back together. You had to put it back together physically and try to do it mentally as well. And the mental part was probably just as difficult, if not more, than the physical part. But there were some successes. Uh, you know, the Republicans reached their two main goals: rebuild the Union and repair the South. So restore the country back together and start rebuilding the South. Economic growth in the South occurred. It didn't mean that didn't mean everybody was wealthy. Of course, most people stayed pretty poor, but there was growth and there was new wealth in the North. So the economy is helped after the war finishes, and Southern states do adopt a better education system in general. Of course, you have a whole new group of people who can be educated now, and with the African Americans, and so whites and blacks alike, uh, you know, they didn't necessarily go to school, public school like we have today, but there were some schools that pop up, and some better education occurs than what had previously been in place before the war. But there were some failures of Reconstruction as well. Most black Southerners stayed in poverty. It was just hard to get out of that sharecropping system, and or if you did something else, which most people did farm because it's what they knew, but other people, there were a few other jobs you could have, but it was just a cycle of poverty. It was really hard to get out of. Also, right after the war, the Union, the North, had put troops into the South, or federal troops were put into the South to kind of keep order, but the federal troops get removed, and so after not too long, and so Southern states do things like their black codes, and the KKK pops up, and they deny blacks their rights, and so these people should have been given equality and equal freedoms, and they just weren't, and so that was a failure of Reconstruction, and also, of course, racist attitudes continued in places in both the North and the South. Racism is an individual problem. Uh, a person has to decide for themselves how they're going to feel about other people, and of course, we would like it that everybody be loving and kind toward others, but that's just not always the case. And but racism is ignorance. Racism is foolishness. But unfortunately, when somebody is racist, it affects other people. And so we see examples of this. We see examples of racism after the Civil War. And of course, racism exists today. Uh, but I think most people are good people. Most people are not racist. Most people just want to live their life and let others live their lives too. But there are some people that are racist. And again, that's their problem. That's their own ignorance and stupidity for being that way. But if racism is going to be uh, wiped out, it's got to be done on an individual level, and each person has to decide for themselves to love other people for who they are. And so anyway, this is this will wrap up then our lengthy review. I know this is long, it's big, but a big review, but this is kind of, we're talking hundreds of years of U.S. history that I've just gone over, and in the last just under 3 hours. So anyway, hopefully you remember some of this stuff from having studied it previously in U.S. history, and hopefully you learn some new things as well. But this kind of gives you a footing for going forward now. You know, after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, we have to get our nation back on its feet. We have to get people back on board with what America's about. And now we enter into a time not only of mass immigration continuing, but into the country, but also mass inventions and new technology. And the country is going to change. The country is going to kind of be reborn after the Civil War, and it's going to be an exciting time in a lot of ways in U.S. history. So that is our review. I hope you enjoyed it.